Hello, this is Diane Zach. To help you understand nested loops, we'll walk through the code contained in a modified version of the clock application from Chapter 16. We'll open the code editor window, scroll down to view the Start button's click event procedure. The procedure contains two for next loops, one nested inside the other. The outer for next loop controls the number of hours and will go from 0 to 2. The inner for next loop controls the number of minutes, and that one will go from 0 to 4. Click Debug, Step Into. Now we'll click the Start button, and then move the form out of the way. As we are stepping through the code in the Start button's click event procedure, pay attention to the hours and minutes that appear on the form. Press F8 to process the procedure header. The outer for clause creates the int hours variable and initializes it to 0. It also compares that value with the number 2 to see if the instructions within the outer loop have to be processed. In this case, 0 is not greater than 2, so the computer will need to process the instructions. This instruction will display the contents of the int hours variable on the form. And here's where that 0 appears. The inner for clause creates the int minutes variable and initializes it to 0. It also compares the contents of the variable with the number 4 to see if the instruction in the inner loop needs to be processed. In this case, 0 is not greater than 4, so the instruction will need to be processed. That instruction will display the contents of int minutes on the form. And here's where the number of minutes appears. The next instruction is the inner next clause. After the instruction is processed, the computer will update the int minutes variable by adding 1 to it. It'll then compare the value in int minutes with the number 4 to see if the instruction in the inner loop needs to be processed again. In this case, int minutes, which is now 1, is not greater than 4, so the instruction will need to be processed. Notice that the number of minutes now appears as 1. When the next clause is processed again, it'll update int minutes to 2. 2 is not greater than 4, so the instruction within the loop will need to be processed again. Now the number 2 appears as the number of minutes. Again, the next clause is processed. It will update int minutes to 3. 3 is not greater than 4, so the instruction in the inner loop will be processed again. Now the minutes shows up as 3 on the form. When the next clause is processed again, int minutes will be 4. 4 is not greater than 4, so the assignment statement in the inner loop will be processed again. The number of minutes now appears as 4. When the next clause is processed again, int minutes will be 5. 5 is greater than 4, so the inner loop will end, and the next instruction to be processed is the outer next clause. After this instruction is processed, int hours will contain the number 1. 1 is not greater than 2, so the instructions within the outer loop will need to be processed again. The first instruction in the outer loop displays the contents of the int hours variable on the form. The number 1 now shows up as the number of hours. The inner for clause is processed again. In this case, it recreates the int minutes variable and initializes it to 0. 0 is not greater than 4, so the instruction in the inner loop will need to be processed. The form now shows that the number of minutes is 0. The inner next clause is processed again. After the clause is processed, int minutes will contain 1. 1 is not greater than 4, so the assignment statement in the inner loop will need to be processed. Now the number 1 shows up as the number of minutes on the form. Now keep an eye on the form as we process the inner for next statement again. When the inner loop's next clause is processed again, int minutes will contain 5, and the inner loop will end. Processing then will continue with the outer loop's next clause. After that clause is processed, int hours will contain 2. 2 is not greater than 2, so the instructions in the outer loop will need to be processed again. The form now shows that the number of hours is 2. The inner for clause is processed one more time. Here again, it recreates int minutes and initializes it to 0. 0 is not greater than 4, so the instruction within the inner loop will be processed again. And the form shows 0 as the number of minutes. Keep an eye on the number of minutes displayed on the form as we step through the inner loop's code again. When the inner next clause is processed again, int minutes will contain the number 5, which means the inner loop will end. Processing then will continue with the outer loop's next clause. After this clause is processed, int hours will contain the number 3. 3 is greater than 2, so the outer loop will end, and processing will continue with the end sub clause, which will end the procedure. To continue without using the debugger, we'll select Debug on the menu bar and then click Stop Debugging. You have now completed the video on nested loops.